Hey YouTube, it's Blue. As you know, I'm a police officer in Miami with over 10 years of experience. Today, I'm going to use that knowledge and experience to review the case of Gerard John Schaefer, an American serial killer known as the Killer Cop. This case brings us to my home state of Florida, with crimes that occurred from Martin County to as far south as Broward County. A case like this is tricky, and the exact number of victims is unknown. But we'll go through what we do know, and I'll attempt to identify every time there was a failure that allowed Schaefer to get away with and continue his crimes, so we can answer our series' ultimate question: how did he get away with it for so long? If you like this content, feel free to subscribe. We'll be doing weekly uploads here covering all types of crime cases. Now, let's get to it. As always, let's first start with the background of our subject. Gerard John Schaefer was born in Wisconsin on March 26, 1946. Schaefer had two siblings and was raised by his father, Gerard John Schaefer Sr., and his mother, Doris Marie Schaefer. Schaefer's father was a traveling salesman and his mother was a housewife. He was raised in Tennessee and Georgia until he and his family relocated to Florida in 1960. He would say that he had a difficult childhood, due to frequent relocations, but also due to verbal abuse from his father. However, Schaefer would be close to his mother, who he described as being very overprotective of him. Schaefer reports that he loved being outdoors, and had hobbies involving guns, hunting, and fishing. While a student at St. Thomas Aquinas High School, he would be described as friendly, but not being part of any particular clique. Growing up, Schaefer aspired to become a forest ranger. Here's where Schaefer enters a darker area of his life. Schaefer claims to have begun fantasizing about women who he said were, quote, worthy of his contempt. Schaefer would elaborate later and claim that these fantasies would devolve into ones including sadomasochism and bondage, and Schaefer began to find pleasure in causing himself physical pain, eventually graduating to autoerotic asphyxiation, a method of masturbation where one chokes themselves to enhance climax. Per Schaefer, he would tie himself to mangrove trees during these sessions, which would become more and more frequent as he grew older. Due to this growing perversion, Schaefer would be known as a peeping Tom in his high school years, and numerous female students would recall Schaefer being known for looking up girls' skirts, and how many female students used to be uncomfortable around him. Aside from this, Schaefer was an above-average student and a promising golfer. He would graduate in June of 1964 and would enroll in Broward Community College. He would then marry Martha Lewis Fogg in December of 1968, but this marriage would quickly end on May 2nd of 1970, after Martha would claim that Schaefer was cruel and that he would spend excessive amount of time away from her while he was hunting. Schaefer would become a teacher at Plantation High School for a very brief period. He would be employed from September 23rd to November 7th of the same year, and fired for refusing to accept instruction from superiors and for forcing inappropriate political and personal views onto the students. Schaefer would get another teaching position, but would be let go after several weeks there as well. Here's where Schaefer would be introduced to police work. He would apply at the Wilton Manors Police Department, lying on his application about being fired from 2 prior positions. Schaefer's background would not be verified, and he would go on to become a patrolman with the department. Just prior to this, Schaefer would marry for a second time to Teresa Dean, who would share his passion for fishing and met his frequent demands for sex. Schaefer would only last 6 months in this position, something we can assume he must be getting used to at this point. This time, it was because he was performing poorly as an officer, and because Schaefer had a worrying habit of taking traffic stops on cars driven by females just to ask them on dates. Just prior to being fired, Schaefer had already applied at the Martin County Sheriff's Office for better pay. He forged a letter of recommendation from his Broward agency, which was not verified by Martin County. Here's where we can speak to a common failure that we have covered in many cases during this time period, and that is a major lack of communication. It's fairly obvious that Schaefer would not have been hired by Martin County Sheriff's Office had they called to verify his employment record and letter of recommendation. The behavior of stopping cars because women are driving them to ask them out is a major red flag and a violation of their rights, even if he claimed they were stopped for a valid equipment violation. The bottom line is that Schaefer should not have been a cop again at this point, and likely wouldn't have been had a proper background check been done. Schaefer would be hired here on June 23, 1972. Only 1 month later, we have our first recorded abduction that he would commit. July 21st, 1972. Schaefer was on patrol in Martin County. While on patrol, he would encounter 2 teenage hitchhikers, an 18-year-old Nancy Trotter and a 17-year-old Paula Wells. Despite the rules against something like this, Schaefer decided to give the 2 a ride and drove them to Stewart at their request. While driving, Schaefer supposedly educated the girls on the dangers of hitchhiking. These girls trusted Schaefer because he was a cop, someone who was supposed to protect them. The girls would then tell him they were from out of state and were going to Junction Beach the next day. Continuing with his unprofessional and inappropriate behavior, Schaefer said he would meet the girls and drive them to the beach tomorrow in his police vehicle. Both girls would agree, because for hitchhikers, who should be safer to ride with than a friendly cop, right? It's understandable how he was able to get them to so readily agree to this. The next day at 9:15 in the morning, Schaefer picked the 2 girls up. This time, he would arrive in his personal car and in regular clothing, explaining to the girls that he was working undercover. Schaefer began to drive them to Jensen Beach, but took a detour, claiming to want to show the girls an old Spanish fort nearby. While driving there, Schaefer began to act strange and explained to the girls again the dangers of hitchhiking, and warned them about the possibility of being sold into what he would describe white slavery. Here's where the story takes a terrifying turn for the girls. Schaefer would pull up to an old shed, where he would handcuff and gag both Nancy and Paula. This entire area was mangrove trees, which are trees with very large and tall roots. Here, Schaefer would lead each girl to a tree and bind their legs to the trunk. He then hung a noose on the branches above, placing it around their necks. The noose was fashioned in such a way that Nancy and Paula would have to stand perfectly straight or the pressure would become too great on their neck, resulting in them hanging themselves. Take a look at the picture of these trees to truly understand how hard this was for them. In such a human environment, with such narrow roots, one wrong step would result in their death. Schaefer would then inform both terrified girls that he was going to rape and murder them. But here, we get a saving grace. Schaefer, who was evidently actually working at this time, received a transmission from dispatchers to report to the police station. Schaefer, incredibly enough, left both girls alive and alone and warned them to not try and escape as he would be very close by. Reportedly, he told the girls he was going to talk to the person that he planned to sell them to. 2 hours later, Schaefer would return. Incredibly enough, he was shocked both Nancy and Paula had managed to escape. After screaming out in rage and likely fear at what he knew was to come, he did something very unexpected. He went home and called his boss, Sheriff Robert Crowder. Schaefer would actually confess to what he had done, but attempted to downplay it, saying, "I've done something very foolish. You're going to be mad at me." He explained what he had just done to Nancy and Paula, and actually tried to justify it by saying he was just teaching the girls a lesson in the dangers of hitchhiking, but that he had overdone it. When asked where the girls were, Schaefer said he had abandoned them, and now they were gone. Sheriff Crowder, along with Lieutenant Melvin Waldron, understood how insane Schaefer's story was, and immediately proceeded to the area along Florida State Road A1A, where they would eventually discover Nancy, who was still partially gagged and with her hands tied behind her back. Incredibly, Nancy was swimming in a brackish river using a flutter kick. Crowder and Waldron stopped their car, and Nancy would, with difficulty, run up the bank towards the pair. Crowder would remove her gag, and she would identify herself as Nancy and immediately ask for help for her friend, who she thought was still in the woods. Crowder informed her that Paula was safe and had been picked up by a trucker and brought to the police station. Nancy was relieved, and then agreed to go back with them to explain the horror of the last few hours. Nancy and Paula would go on to describe how they encountered Schaefer and what he had done to them. The question on everyone's mind was, how had the girls escaped? Both girls stated that while they were bound to the trees, there was just enough slack in the ropes to allow them to strain against them repeatedly, eventually loosening them enough that they were able to slide their legs out. Both girls did this while their hands were handcuffed behind their backs, with a noose tightly around their neck, and while standing on those thin mangrove roots we saw earlier. This is really an incredible feat, and the girls made it clear that they were in a constant fear that one misstep would have resulted in them being hung. Both girls truly believed that they were going to die as a result of their encounter with Schaefer. It is by the grace of God and the determination of their resolve that these girls are alive today. Even more commendable is their follow-through with pressing charges on Schaefer. While that may seem simple, in my career, I have seen and handled literally hundreds, if not thousands of cases where the victim, no matter how serious the crime was, just stopped showing up to court. Many people, once someone is arrested, feel that their involvement is over. Some don't have the mental strength to go through a trial and relive their crimes, or to have to face their attacker in court where they may be confronted by them during a cross-examination. Anytime someone follows through to ensure their attacker faces justice, as these girls did, they ensure to the best of their ability that their attacker not only won't hurt them again, but also that they cannot hurt anyone else in the future. At least, that's how it should be. But the police, victims, and prosecutors can't force judges to give adequate sentence to criminals. And sometimes, despite our best efforts, weak sentences are given. Let's take a look at what happens next. Nancy and Paula would give police a description of Schaefer in his personal vehicle, and later would identify him in a photo lineup. This is where a group of several photos is compiled, with only one being a picture of the actual assailant. This is to verify the strength and accuracy of the identification of the suspect. Schaefer would stick to his asinine defense, continually claiming that he was just teaching the girls a lesson about the dangers of hitchhiking. He would maintain this defense through the entire trial. Despite this, Sheriff Crowder would see right through it and did the absolute right thing, firing Schaefer and charging him with 2 counts of false imprisonment and 2 counts of aggravated assault. Schaefer would be arrested the same day and would bond out on $15,000 bail 2 weeks later. His trial would be set for November 1972. While waiting, Schaefer would work at a quick check store, with family and friends saying that he had no major change in his demeanor. Oddly enough, they seemed to believe Schaefer's story. September 27, 1972. Schaefer, while out on bond, would abduct and murder 2 women, a 17-year-old Susan Carol Place and a 16-year-old Georgia Marie Jessup. Both girls encountered Schaefer while they were all attending an adult education class in Fort Lauderdale. Schaefer introduced himself to both girls as Jerry Shepard, telling them that he was from Colorado and that he was going to go back there after a vacation to Mexico. It was believed by parents and detectives that Schaefer gained the girls' trust by feigning an interest in Georgia's love of reincarnation and in Susan's love of music. That same afternoon, Susan's mother, Lucille, came home and discovered Susan cleaning her bedroom, and noted Schaefer, introduced to her as Jerry, was present with the girls. Susan told Lucille that she, Georgia, and Jerry were going to drive to a beach in Fort Lauderdale to play guitar and hang out. Lucille was suspicious, as Jerry appeared to be a decade older than both girls, in his mid to late 20s. Schaefer tried to assure her that he was a nice guy and had no ill intentions, but thankfully, she took down his license plate number on his 1969 Datsun. Lucille confronted Susan, worried that she was actually running away. Susan began to cry and told her mother that she was, but that she would be away just for a little while, and would remain in contact. Susan and Georgia then left the home with Schaefer at 8:45 p.m. that night. 4 days later, after Susan had not returned or called her, Lucille had called Georgia's mother and learned that Georgia had also run away from home on the same date, and that she also had not heard from either girl since. At this time, again, 4 days later, these 17 and 16-year-old girls were reported missing to the police. While I do not condone victim blaming, we have to assess what happened here, and on this channel we try to identify every area of failure that allows killers to continue their crimes as long as they do. Here, we have a 16 and 17-year-old girl who come home with a strange man a decade older than them, telling their mother that they're leaving with him and will be back in a short while, and that they'll stay in touch. Anyone who has ever met or known teenagers knows that a 17-year-old is an entirely different person compared to somebody in their mid-20s. This should have raised major red flags to the mother, and it is absolutely crazy to think that Susan's plans were not met with resistance or reported immediately to the police. However, it would seem that perhaps this was not such an unusual occurrence, based on the reaction and delayed reporting of both parents. In either event, we can't help but wonder if this had been reported immediately, that both girls might be alive today. So, back to the investigation. Lucille provided the license plate number and description of Jerry Shepard and his car to police. The registration will be traced to an entirely different model of vehicle, belonging to a man in St. Petersburg who did not match Schaefer's description and was ruled out early on due to having a firm alibi. There was only one man living in Fort Lauderdale with the legal name of Jerry Shepard, but he was eliminated early on as a suspect. By 1973, the case of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup had gone cold. October 26, 1972. 14-year-old Mary Briscolina and 13-year-old Elise Farmer vanished while hitchhiking to a restaurant from a hotel in Lauderdale by the Sea, just 1 month after Georgia and Susan disappeared. Their bodies would be found in some undergrowth in the city of Plantation in early 1973. Mary's body had been badly beaten, with one heavy blow to the head having been determined to be the fatal blow. An autopsy also revealed that Mary had fought fiercely against her attacker, as her fingernails had been torn off in the struggle. Elise had also been severely beaten on the head with a blunt object and left to die with Mary. Both girls' bodies were found with their legs spread apart, leading investigators to suspect a sexual assault had taken place. During the subsequent investigation, detectives would interview friends of Mary and Elise. They discovered the girls would frequently visit an apartment in Lauderdale by the Sea, which was rented by Mary's older sister's boyfriend. This individual was known as Gary Shepard, a man who claimed to be a Wilton Manors police officer. Several of those interviewed would later identify this Gary Shepard as Schaefer. January 11, 1973. 3 months after the disappearance of Elise and Mary, 2 more would be taken. Paulette Marie Goodenough and Barbara Ann Wilcox, both 19, disappeared while hitchhiking from Sioux City, Iowa to Florida. Both girls were last seen alive in Biloxi, Mississippi. Their disappearances occurred while Schaefer remained free prior to going to prison for the abductions of Nancy and Paula. Schaefer, an investigation would later reveal, made a long-distance call from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to his Florida residence just before the girls would be reported missing. It is believed that Schaefer encountered Barbara and Colette while driving back to Florida. Both girls' skeletal remains would be discovered close to a large tree and an orange crate years later, in January of 1977. Both victims had been bound together with baling wire. An examination of the crime scene would show that there were impressions on nearby tree branches, which would indicate that one or both of the victims had been suspended from the branches as their killer had watched while sitting on the nearby crate. December 1972. Schaefer appears in court for the abduction of Nancy and Paula. A plea bargain was offered to him, so instead of being charged for 2 counts of aggravated assault and 2 counts of false imprisonment, or 4 third-degree felonies, he was only charged with 1 count of aggravated assault. The plea deal outlines his sentence, showing he would only have to spend 1 year in jail, with the possibility of being paroled after 6 months, followed by 3 years of probation. Now, this may not have resulted in the carnage that weak sentences have before, as in some of the other cases we've covered, but it shows a trend that still continues today. Perhaps the prosecutors are afraid of losing a conviction at trial, or the judge takes pity on the convicted. In either event, these light sentences for very serious and troubling crimes are sickening, and something that allows criminals to continually terrorize their communities, even until this day. It's a smack in the face to the victims of these crimes, the officers and detectives who spend days, weeks, or months to build a good case, and to the people in the community who the system fails to keep safe by these decisions. December 22nd, 1972. Schaefer accepts a plea deal and is sentenced. Upon sentencing, Judge D.C. Smith reveals his feelings about Schaefer in a statement. It is beyond the court's imagination to conceive how you were such a foolish and astronomical jackass as you were in this case. I only wish the judge's sentence had been as harsh as his words. In a show of undeserved mercy, Judge Smith postponed Schaefer's sentence until after the holidays, allowing him to remain a free man until January 15, 1973. Upon leaving court, Schaefer would tell reporters, "I made a stupid mistake. There was no sex involved and no one was hurt." In March of 1973, while Schaefer was serving time on his paltry sentence, Lucille Place discovered a letter while searching her daughter Susan's room. This letter was from a Jerry Shepard, and it had a return address of 333 Martin Avenue in Stuart, Florida. Lucille would talk to the building manager and discovered that a Jerry Shepard had registered at the property under his real name, Gerard Schaefer, and that he was recently sent to jail for the abduction of 2 girls. This news was shocking to Lucille and her husband, Ira. As they drove around the county, she began to realize it's possible the investigators had made a mistake with the license plate she had given them when she had reported her daughter missing. The investigator had noted the license plate as being registered to Pinellas County as opposed to Martin County. Most license plates out of Martin County begin with 42, and Pinellas license plates begin with a single 4, likely why they had told her that the address came back to a Pinellas County address. Lucille would relay this information to detectives, and upon checking the license plate in the correct county, would see that it came back to a blue-green Datsun registered to a Gerard Schaefer, who resided at 333 Martin Avenue. Schaefer would be questioned while in jail and denied ever meeting Susan, Georgia, or Lucille. However, Lucille would positively identify a photograph of Schaefer, which was his personnel photo when he was employed at Wilton Manors Police Department. April 1st, 1973. A father and son, while searching for aluminum cans, discovered the badly decomposed remains of 2 people. They were located in and around a hole that had been dug among some trees in Oak Hammond Park, in Port St. Lucie, Florida. The grave was 2 football fields from the nearest dirt road. An examination of the crime scene was performed, and deep scratch marks were seen at the base of the tree immediately next to the gravesite. Still bound to the tree were the remains of a human torso. One of the victims was still wearing blue jeans, with a very unique circular pattern of the Roadrunner on them, and the other victim's body was completely naked. Nearby, a pile of clothes from both victims was located in tall grass. This was a difficult scene to investigate, as local wildlife had scattered and damaged some of the remains in the nearby area. This gravesite was 6 miles from where Nancy and Paula had been held captive before their escape. An autopsy of their remains determined that both bodies were girls who had been bound and murdered, and their spines had been severed at the lumbar and cervical section, with several other bones completely and roughly severed with a large knife or machete. Both bodies appeared to have been decapitated after their death, but the jawbones showed signs of numerous fractures after being bludgeoned by a heavy blunt object. One set of remains would later be identified as Susan Place, and it was determined her jawbone had evidence of a gunshot wound consistent with a .22 caliber round. Again, evidence from a nearby banyan tree indicated that one or both girls had been hung long enough to leave impressions within the bark, and the initials G, J had been carved into the same tree trunk. The roots of the same tree had numerous deep incisions from a machete or axe, and these incisions would contain torn sections of clothing fibers. Both bodies were taken to the Dade County Medical Examiner's office, where forensic dentist Richard Sauvron identified the victims via dental records as Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. That's right, this is the same dentist that helped secure the conviction and subsequent death sentence for Ted Bundy. Schaefer would be informed of the positive identification of both girls, at which time he immediately requested the services of the public defender. The discovery of the remains, the similarity of the modus operandi for this unknown killer and for the crime Schaefer was serving time for, as well as Schaefer being identified as Jerry Shepard, was more than enough for a search warrant to be obtained. Detectives in both Martin and Broward County Sheriff's Departments would acquire warrants for Schaefer's home and vehicle, as well as his mother's home. What was discovered would shock and disgust police. Inside of Schaefer's old locked bedroom in his mother's home, police would make many disturbing discoveries. 300 pages of perverse and disgusting stories authored by Schaefer himself were found, written over several years. All these stories detailed the humiliation, kidnapping, rape, and executions by hanging of numerous teenage girls and young women. The women were constantly referred to as whores, sluts, or harlots, and 2 were mentioned by name, Belinda and Carmen. Another woman was described as being hung in an unknown wooded area near Powerline Road. In some of these stories, Schaefer had forced his victims to drink lots of beer or wine, as he liked to watch them as they were forced to urinate on themselves while they were nearly hanging from the trees. I don't know whether to classify these writings as stories or actual accounts of what he has done, but the truth seems to lie somewhere in between, as we will soon discover. Schaefer describes himself returning to their bodies weeks or months later, having sex with the decaying corpses, or to take their teeth as trophies. Also found in the home were a bag of 11 firearms, filled with live and spent rounds, 13 hunting knives, copious amounts of rope, and numerous pornographic magazines that had been edited to make the women appear as if they were bound with rope and urinating on themselves, hanging from trees or covered in bullet wounds. Even more disturbing than the writings and magazines were 37 black and white Polaroid pictures depicting real women being hung or mutilated. Most of them appeared to be among Melaleuca plants, leading officers to believe they were in the area of Davie, Florida. The pictures were such poor quality that no women could be identified from them. Several of the pictures showed Schaefer himself wearing a dress, simulating his own hanging from a tree with feces smeared across his butt. I know how disturbing these are to hear, but there was yet more to discover inside the home. Detectives found a letter dated July 20th, 1971 from an individual in an area of Victoria, Australia. Apparently, Schaefer had met him in Morocco in the summer of 1970. In this letter were multiple images, apparently taken after a massacre in a village in the Sahara, showing women who had been disemboweled and mutilated with axes and knives. Inside a nearby jewelry box, personal items belonging to several teenage girls had been discovered. A heart-shaped charm with the initials MTN were unable to be linked to any missing persons case. Other items, such as a gold locket with the name Leigh, was discovered to belong to a young woman named Leigh Bonadies. Leigh was a neighbor of Schaefer's when both were teenagers, and had been missing since September of 1969. A driver's license for Barbara Ann Wilcox was discovered alongside a passport for Colette Goodenough, letting us know what fate came to the hitchhiking girls we mentioned earlier. Teeth and bone fragments belonging to 8 different victims were recovered as well. April 6, 1973. Detectives would serve a search warrant on Schaefer's home and car, and would discover 2 human teeth inside his bedroom, more knives and firearms in a shed outside, and a very blood-stained pillowcase that had just been washed. A purse belonging to Georgia Jessup was also discovered. This purse was a distinctive suede purse, and Schaefer's wife would claim it to be hers. When asked how she got it, she would claim Schaefer had given it to her as a gift in November of 1972. Keep in mind, Susan and Georgia disappeared in September of 1972. Interestingly enough, Schaefer had just instructed his wife and his brother-in-law to get rid of the purse, claiming that the police were going to use it to try to pin other crimes on him. Thankfully, the brother-in-law kept the purse and gave it over to police. May 12, 1973. Detectives had gathered enough evidence to link Schaefer to 9 murders and unsolved disappearances between 1969 and 1973. The same month, a newspaper published a list of 28 missing women and girls believed to be linked to Schaefer, in the hopes anyone with information would come forward. May 18, 1973. Schaefer was formally charged in the murder for killing Susan and Georgia. He was held with no bond and would remain in jail until his trial resolved. Schaefer was made to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, and the doctor who examined him concluded Schaefer suffered from paranoia, psychosis, and acute sexual deviation, as he viewed himself as an eliminator of women he deemed immoral. Schaefer, despite this, was ruled competent to stand trial. September 17, 1973. Because the murders had occurred during a time when the death penalty was considered unconstitutional in Florida, prosecutors had to seek a life sentence. No plea deal was offered, thankfully. During the pre-trial hearings, Schaefer was asked to provide an alibi for the night the girls went missing, and he came up with the unbeatable defense of, "I don't know, I can't remember where I was." Taking the advice of his attorney, he would not testify during the trial. Susan's mother, however, would take the stand and identify Schaefer as the one who had left her home that night with her daughter. Georgia's parents would take the stand and identify the purse that Schaefer had given to his wife as a gift as the same purse they had bought for Georgia. Dr. Richard Souvron withstood intense cross-examination and defended his identification of the victims, explaining his methods. Nancy and Paula would come and testify against Schaefer a second time, and I cannot commend them enough for doing this. Both girls would testify and demonstrate how Schaefer had tied them up and made it so any attempt at escape would cause them to hang themselves. A reenactment of how the girls were tied up was shown to the jury as well. Incredibly enough, Schaefer and his attorneys wanted this to be shown, as Schaefer believed because he had not actually hurt the girls, it helped him appear innocent. Finally, a manuscript handwritten by Schaefer on how to properly execute women, as well as all his perverse writings, were shown to the jury. At this, the prosecution rested its case. One tactic of Schaefer's defense team was to distance him from the evidence of the skull found, specifically the one with the bullet hole in it. You see, despite all the guns found at his residence, none of them was a .22 caliber, the same caliber that was found to have been shot into Susan Place's jaw. However, the state would bring in Schaefer's brother-in-law, who claimed that he had seen on multiple occasions Schaefer to have a .22 caliber handgun, which he called his Saturday night special. Ultimately, Schaefer's weak protests of innocence would amount to nothing. Schaefer would be found guilty by a jury of his peers, and after only 5 hours of deliberation. At this time, his defense team argued he should be sent to a mental health hospital and not a prison, which was rejected by the court. Schaefer was sentenced to 2 life sentences. Even so, life is often not really life in the judicial system. The statutes indicated that Schaefer would likely be eligible for parole after 14 to 19 years of prison. Fortunately, the courts were able to revise his earliest release date to 2016. Over the years, Schaefer would proclaim his innocence, refusing to accept responsibility for the crimes the world knew he had committed. Humorously enough, Schaefer's defense attorney, Elton Schwartz, would marry Schaefer's wife 2 months after his imprisonment. It is difficult to know what is true when dealing with a monster like Schaefer. For instance, he would on one hand for years claim to not know Susan or Georgia, but on the other hand call the girls heroin addicts, police informants, or sluts. Schaefer, after some time, began to write stories under a new genre he called killer fiction. Schaefer wanted his readers to be able to see the acts of murder and necrophilia in the harsh reality of life. He would claim these works were fiction, but investigators believe these accounts are full or partial accounts of his own crimes. Schaefer would file numerous frivolous lawsuits against authors and newspapers who called him a serial killer. Yet in letters to crime authors he claimed to be the worst killer ever, describing himself as worse than Ted Bundy. He would continue to write stories describing the graphic torture and murder of victims, which police still believed were the stories of how he murdered his actual victims. Schaefer would confirm this in a letter to his attorney, claiming a story called Night Demons recounts the murders of Briscalina and Farmer. Later into his sentence, he began to confess to other murders. He did this to an old girlfriend and author who was working to publish his works with him, Sandra London. We should note here that publicly, he was denying he had committed any murders. But in letters to London, Schaefer claimed to have begun murdering women in 1965, when he was age 19. In another, he claimed to be responsible for the December 1969 disappearance of two schoolgirls, 9-year-old Peggy Ron and 8-year-old Wendy Stevenson, whom he claimed to have kidnapped from Pompano Beach and cannibalized. Publicly, Schaefer had denied any involvement. To show how despicable and unrepentant Schaefer was, here's a sample of a letter he wrote to London about his murder of Susan in Georgia. "When I nabbed Jessup in place, I had been in the ghoul game for almost 10 years, so I knew what to expect from these juicy young creatures at the end. Doing doubles is far more difficult than doing singles, but on the other hand, it also puts one in a position to have twice as much fun. There can be some lively discussions about which of the victims will get to be killed first. When you have a pair of lively teenage bimbalinas bound hand and foot and ready for a session with a skinning knife, neither one of the little devils wants to be the first to go, and they don't mind telling you quickly why their best friend should be the one to die." Truly disgusting. December 3rd, 1995. Here's where we reach the best part of our story. Schaefer would be stabbed to death on the floor of his cell by a fellow inmate after an argument over a cup of hot water. An autopsy revealed that he had been stabbed over 40 times in the face, head, neck, and body, with his throat also having been slashed. Schaefer's right eye was destroyed, and several of his ribs were fractured. Upon getting news of Schaefer's murder, the judge who presided over the murder trial, Cyrus Towbridge, stated he's finally gotten the death sentence he ultimately deserved but couldn't be given. At the time of his death, detectives in Broward were preparing to bring an additional 3 murder charges against him, to both get justice for the victims and their families, and to ensure he would never be eligible for parole. Just like with Bundy and Gacy, there is no clear consensus on when Schaefer started killing, or how many victims he actually had. Since he had not admitted to his crimes publicly before his death, as Bundy did, we will likely never know the true extent of them. However, based on his personal writings and admissions, and evidence gathered during his warrants, along with the tireless efforts of detectives, we have at least an idea. Maybe one day we'll be able to close these cases and give the families closure on likely the worst chapter of their lives. A conservative estimate of Schaefer's murders is 11, but the estimate goes as high as 28. In one letter, Schaefer claimed to have about 80 victims. We'll include as much of this list as we can, including what investigators believe ties these crimes to Schaefer, but there are inconsistencies that may exclude some victims on that list. Some artifacts discovered in Schaefer's mother's homes were linked to several males that were reported missing. However, some of these males were either reported to have been alive at the time of Schaefer's arrest, or died at a later date. In an attempt to be as accurate as possible, let's go over a timeline of his most likely victims. Please keep in mind, Schaefer was found to have 37 photographs of hung and mutilated women, taken likely in the Davie area. It is likely that Schaefer has a much higher victim count, as it is possible many of these women were never reported missing. October 2nd, 1966. 21-year-old Nancy Leichner and 20-year-old Pamela Ann Nader were last seen alive hiking in the Alexander Springs Wilderness Recreation Area of the Ocala National Forest. Although authorities initially believed the two had drowned while swimming, this theory was ultimately disproven. Schaefer later would confess to their murders. September 8th, 1969. 24-year-old Leigh Bonadies, a newlywed waitress who had known Schaefer since both were teenagers. She was last known to have left a note to her husband of 2 weeks indicating she intended to drive to Miami, but would return home that evening. Schaefer later claimed to a private investigator that Bonadies had phoned him on the date of her disappearance asking for a ride to the Miami International Airport, but that she had never called him back. Her skull, bearing 3 bullet holes, was discovered at a construction site in Palm Beach County in April of 1978. December 18th, 1969. 22-year-old Carmen Marie Hollick. Hollick disappeared after informing her sister she had an appointment with a male teacher from Broward Community College who may be able to provide her with a government job. She was last seen wearing a black chiffon dress. One of the stories Schaefer is known to have penned prior to his arrest recounts the hanging and mutilation of a girl with auburn hair wearing a black chiffon dress. 2 of Hollick's teeth and a gold shamrock pin that belonged to her were found at Schaefer's home. December 29th, 1969. 9-year-old Peggy Ron and 8-year-old Wendy Stevenson would last be seen by their relatives at Pompano Beach walking towards a parking lot to purchase ice cream cones. Their bodies have never been found. Several years after his conviction, Schaefer sent a letter to his girlfriend in which he confessed to killing the children. Several investigators dispute the authenticity of this confession, as the individual last known to have seen the girls alive had described both girls, still clad in their bathing suits, in the company of a man whose physical description markedly contrasts with Schaefer's. This account would also be disputed because another known serial pedophile would be suspected of their disappearance, Kenneth Guy Schultz. After Schultz's arrest, police would recover a notebook, where Schultz had recorded entries of his crimes. One such entry was labeled Peggy and Wendy, Pompano Beach. Schultz would never be charged with the crime as investigators didn't believe they had enough, and no confession would be given. January 4th, 1972. 22-year-old Belinda Hutchins. Hutchins was a married cocktail waitress with a 10-month-old daughter, who also worked as a high-class call girl. She is known to have briefly dated Schaefer shortly after his application to serve with the Broward County Police Department. She was last seen entering a blue Datsun parked outside her home. Police later recovered an address book identified as belonging to Hutchins and containing the name Jerry Shepard from Schaefer's home. February 29th, 1972. 13-year-old Deborah Sue Lowe. Lowe was last seen walking to Richards Middle School. Her schoolbooks were later discovered in a trash bin 1 block from her home. Her body has never been found. Lowe's family strongly believed Schaefer, who had worked with her father and previously visited their home, was involved in her disappearance. March 19, 1972. 20-year-old Bonnie Taylor. Taylor was a Wilton Manors resident whom Schaefer is known to have stopped for a speeding violation shortly before her disappearance on the same day. No further information exists on this case. August 11, 1972. 46-year-old Leonard Masser. A coffee shop proprietor last seen alive at a Riviera beach bar. His handless body was discovered buried on Hutchinson Island on January 3, 1973, close to where Schaefer had bound and threatened Nancy and Paula. No direct evidence exists to indicate Schaefer's culpability in this murder or the murder of any male. However, Schaefer is known to have referenced Masser's murder in correspondence following his murder conviction. August 31, 1972. 22-year-old Elizabeth Wilt. A native of Fayetteville, Arkansas, Wilt had traveled to Florida to attend the 1972 Republican National Convention. Her last contact with her stepmother was a letter dated August 30th, postmarked from Miami Beach, in which she indicated her imminent return to Arkansas. Wilt's body has never been found. December 23, 1972. 15-year-old Suzanne Poole. Poole was a Fort Lauderdale teenager reported missing by her family shortly before Christmas of 1972. Her partial skeletal remains were discovered on June 16, 1974, still bound to a mangrove tree in a swampland district of Singer Island. Her remains were identified in May 2022 via genetic genealogy. The circumstances of her disappearance and murder led authorities to believe she may have been a victim of Schaefer, who had been temporarily freed from court 1 day before the estimated date of Poole's disappearance. Let's talk for a minute about what makes serial killers so scary. One of the most terrifying things about serial killers is that they tend to blend in as ordinary people, being some of the last ones you'd expect. We saw this with Gacy and Bundy, who were the last people most would have suspected to be capable of any crime. However, even more terrifying is a serial killer that's a cop. While we don't know how many of these abductions happened while Schaefer was in uniform or in a police unit, we can imagine at times Schaefer used his position or title to gain the trust of victims, especially the young ones. One thing about police, we have a huge amount of authority in certain circumstances, especially when dealing with compliant people who have no reason to distrust us. It would not be at all difficult, especially in this time period, to stop somebody, arrest them, and once the handcuffs are on, have them in your total control. While Schaefer is an exceptionally rare case, this is not the only police officer to abuse his position and use it to kill. We'll cover other cases like this in the future, including a recent prominent one. But I will say that both of the agencies did the right thing in firing Schaefer when he displayed troubling behaviors, like he did at his first agency in stopping women and harassing them for their phone numbers. Martin County Sheriff's Office also did the right thing. They believed the girls and the evidence in front of them. They were not worried about the bad publicity that this would likely generate for their department, and they did not try to cover it up or downplay the incident, something that would have been very easy to do in a rural agency in the 1970s. They followed through and built a good case against Schaefer. Now, I do believe the justice system failed those first girls in offering Schaefer a plea deal. Had he actually gotten out, he no doubt would have started killing again almost immediately. Fortunately, not only were his crimes discovered when he literally had nowhere to go, but thanks to an astute observation by a concerned mother, Schaefer was brought to justice and actually kept in prison until other inmates did what the state of Florida should have been responsible for doing. This is a case where we really just don't know the entire scope of Schaefer's crimes, and we likely will never know just how bad it was. One of the lessons to be learned here is the one that Schaefer actually claimed to be teaching his first victims, that is, not to hitchhike. This practice has largely gotten untold numbers of people hurt or killed in the past. Thankfully, it also is a practice that has largely ended. That's the end of this week's video, YouTube. I hope you enjoyed this case review of the Killer Cop. I'd love some suggestions on any cases you all know of, especially relatively unknown ones that you'd like a cop's perspective on. Like and subscribe if you enjoy the content. And remember, stay tuned and stay safe.